Michael Cohen was pleased on the way I was going to handle these issues. And that was the basis of the conversation. Okay, so now you started to allude to earlier that to some extent this arrangement that you came to at this Trump Tower meeting was mutually beneficial? Yes, that's correct. Can you explain to the jury what you mean by that? When I'm saying mutually beneficial is in writing positive stories about Mr. Trump and covering the election, and writing negative stories about his opponents is only going to increase the newsstand sales of the National Enquirer and the other tabloids. And so for me that was my benefit, and then in doing what publishing these type of stories was also going to benefit his campaign. So that's where I was saying that we were both parties were benefiting from it. Teresa Magnacari relieved Lisa Kramsky as the official court reporter. Q. And so, by each of the things that you agreed to do, did you believe you were doing, both helping Mr. Trump's campaign and also helping sell some magazines? Yes, I needed the help. So the portion of the agreement that involved Q notifying Michael Cohen about negative stories either from women or some other kind of negative story, what was the ultimate objective of that component of the arrangement that you made at Trump Tower? Can you rephrase that question? Q. Yes, wasn't a good question, I will try again. You said that part of the arrangement was that you would notify Trump through Michael Cohen if you came upon negative stories, whether they involved women or just other negative stories. Yes, Q. And what was the purpose of notifying Michael Cohen when you came upon stories like that? Well, as I did in the past, that would be in the past 8 years, when I notified Michael Cohen of a story that was negative story, he would try to vet it himself to see if the story was true or not. He would go to the individual publication to get the story to make sure the story wasn't published and getting killed. Q. Prior to that August 2015 meeting, had you ever purchased a story to not print it about Mr. Trump? No. Q. Now, that part of the deal where you were going to notify them so they could buy up negative information about Mr. Trump, did that part help the National Enquirer at all? How was that going to boost sales of the National Enquirer? No, that didn't help. That is the mutual benefit portion of it. Q. Except that part doesn't have a mutual benefit. Purpose of that component was to benefit the campaign, am I understanding you right? That is right. Q. But the part about running the positive stories, that was mutually beneficial? Yes, the part about running the tabloid stories on the opponents, that was mutually beneficial. Q. Were any of the agreements, the agreement to print the negative stories about the opponents, positive stories from Trump, or the agreement to notify Michael Cohen about potentially negative stories about Donald Trump, were any of those agreements put into writing? No, they weren't put into writing, was just an agreement among friends roughly. How long would you say this meeting lasted? Q. 20 to 25 minutes. Did you discuss this meeting with anyone afterwards? Q. Yes. As a matter when I went back to my office I went immediately back to my office and I met with Dylan Howard. I mentioned his name yesterday, he the chief content officer of the company, and the editor-in-chief of the National Enquirer. I described to him the meeting I just had with Mr. Trump and Michael Cohen, and I described to him that this concept and agreement that I made has to be highly, highly confidential. So what I asked him to do was, I asked him to notify the West Coast Bureau Chief of the National Enquirer, his was Jerry George, and I asked him to notify the East Coast Bureau Chief of the National Enquirer, his name is Barry Levine, and I said that any stories that are out there that are commenting about Donald Trump, commenting about his family, commenting about the election, whatever it might be, I want you to vet the stories, I want you to bring them to me. And then I said, we'll have to speak to Michael Cohen. You will call Michael Cohen, or I will call him, and we'll tell him what the stories are, but I want to make sure we vet them first. Did you tell him why you asked him to keep this arrangement secret? Yes, I did. Q. What did you tell him? I told him that we were going to try to help the campaign, and to do that, I want to keep this as quiet as possible. Q. Because if it came out that you were helping the campaign, it would kind of undermine the whole point. Objection. Mr. Bove, sustained. The court, so let me rephrase that. Why was it important to you that the arrangement be kept secret? We have several hundred people that work within the company, and being a tabloid company, the leaks are probably more prevalent within the organization than outside the organization, and I did not want anyone else to know about this agreement I had and what I wanted to do, so that's why I wanted it very confidential. So did you follow through? Did you publish a series of pro-Trump articles in the National Enquirer? Yes, I am going to show you and only you Q. Well, the attorneys, People's 152. Tell me when you see that pop up on your screen, do you see it? Not yet, no. Yes, I have it in front of me. Q. Do you recognize this document, 152? Yes, Q. What is it? These are articles and covers from the National Enquirer. Q. Is it a document containing several headlines? Yes. For stories about then-candidate Donald Trump that were published in the National Enquirer between the August 2015 meeting and around the time of the presidential election in 2016? Yes, that's correct. Q. The headlines correspond to actual stories run in the National Enquirer during that time period? Yes, they are. Q. And are the dates on the headlines accurate? Yes, Q. And, just to be clear, the exhibit is a collection of headlines, not the story itself? Yes, Mr. Steinglass offer them into evidence. Mr. Bove, we have no objection, we would ask for a limiting instruction. The court, jurors, the court is accepting People's 152 into evidence. The exhibit is being admitted for the limited purpose of demonstrating that the articles were published, and the headlines were published, and the dates they were published. Also, to put them into context, to put the rest of the presentation in context. The exhibit is not an evidence for any other Mr. Steinglass, thank you. Evidence. Whereupon, People's Exhibit 152 was received into Mr. Steinglass. Okay, now, may we please display purpose? Q. Pardon me. Q. That's okay. That to everyone. People's 152, this is a series of headlines praising Mr. Trump. That was a question. The question was, are these a series of articles, headlines praising Mr. Trump? Q, yes, I was just reading them. Did each of these headlines correspond to stories that you ran in the National Enquirer? Yes, Q. And running these stories in the National Enquirer, was that in fulfillment of the arrangement that you struck, or part of the arrangement that you struck at the Trump Tower meeting in August 2015? Yes, Q. All right. You also mentioned that another component of that arrangement with Donald Trump and Michael Cohen involved publishing negative stories about Trump's opponents. Is that fair to say? That's correct. Mr. Steinglass, if we can go back to just showing the witness and the attorneys and the court. I am going to show you people's 153A, B, and C. Do you see those? Yes, Q. By the way, Mr. Pecker, have you had a chance to review each of these exhibits prior to today? You are not seeing them for the first time? Yes, I did. Q. What are these exhibits, 153A, B, and C, in most general terms? These are negative articles and cover headlines or images that we published on Mr. Trump's opponents. I would like to say one other thing, if I can. Q. Sure, my conversations with Michael Cohen would call me and would say, we would like for you to a negative article on, let's say for argument's sake, on Ted Cruz. Then he would send me, being Michael Cohen, send me information about Ted Cruz or about Ben Carson or about Marco Rubio that was the basis of our story, and then we would embellish it from there. We, meaning? The National Enquirer. The National Enquirer. I would speak to Dylan, he would hear the story, they would start putting together the pieces of it, the photos, what makes sense, how we would try to do it, how the editorial would be executed. It was a process we were trying to explain, not just coming up with the headline. Q. Thank you for clarifying that. Let me ask you, as part of your answer just now you said that Michael Cohen would call you periodically and say, we would like you to run a negative story about this political opponent or that political opponent, is that correct? Yes, who did you understand we to be referring to? Q. Michael Cohen always told me he was not part of the campaign, so I only assumed that he was talking to Mr. Trump. Q. To or about. When I say we. Q. Right, Michael Cohen wasn't part of the campaign. When he said we, I thought he was talking about himself and Mr. Trump. Q. Now, what did you understand Michael Cohen's relationship to the campaign to be? He always told me he was not part of the campaign. Q. He did not work for the campaign? He told me he wasn't part of the campaign, he didn't work for the campaign, he was on the outside. He kept on saying he was Mr. Trump's personal attorney and that he is a lawyer and he didn't have any issues. He said there was issues with him, with the campaign. Q. And what did you understand, if anything, his relationship to the campaign to be? I don't mean formal. Let me put it this way, did you understand there to be an informal relationship between Mr. Cohen and the campaign? Mr. Bove, objection. The court sustained. What did you understand the relationship to be between Q. Mr. Cohen and the campaign? Mr. Bove, objection. The court overruled. You can answer. Q. What did you understand the relationship between Michael Cohen and the campaign to be? I thought that I am going to say it the best way I can. Michael was physically there in every aspect of whatever the campaign was working on, at least at the Trump Organization, at the Trump Tower. He was physically there where the offices were. I thought, probably, he would have heard things. Wasn't part of the campaign, but I think he may have heard things informally, or he injected himself into it. He said it was informal, that's what I thought, because he said he wasn't part of the campaign. What do you Q. When you say he injected himself into it, mean? If there were issues. For example, let's say that so he is physically, and let's go back to Ted Cruz as an example. That environment, and if he heard, I don't know if he heard it from Mr. Trump or if he heard it from another person within the campaign or someone else, that there are issues about Ted Cruz and we want this negative article to be written, I would only work with Michael, so I don't know who else he spoke to. What I was trying to say. Q. Okay, when you use the phrase inject himself into it, is it the campaign? Yes. Q. So back to exhibits 153A, B, and C. My question is, do these documents contain different headlines for stories about various opponents that Trump was facing in the various primaries that were published in the National Enquirer in the months following your August 2015 meeting with Mr. Trump and Michael Cohen? That's correct. And do the headlines correspond to actual stories run in the National Enquirer during that time period? Yes, Q. And are the dates contained under each of those headlines accurate? Yes, they are. Mr. Steinglass, offer them into evidence. Mr. Bove, no objection, subject to the same limiting instruction. Court People's Exhibits 153A, B, and C are accepted into evidence with the same caveat. At this time they're being admitted for the limited purpose of demonstrating that the article was published on or about a certain date, and to provide, whereupon, People's Exhibits 153A, B, and C were received into evidence. Q. Okay, I would like to now show everyone People's 153A. To which candidate does 153A pertain? Dr. Ben Carson. Q. Were these articles published towards the end of 2015? Yes. Had Ben Carson been gaining popularity in the polls at that time? Yes, he had. And were these headlines run in accordance with your agreement that you had struck at Trump Tower in August of 2015 with Mr. Trump and Michael Cohen? Yes, Q. I'm going to show you 153B and ask you, to whom does this series of headlines pertain? Ted Cruz. Q. I'm going to show you a few in particular. I am displaying the first exhibit on page 1. Does the headline say Ted Cruz shamed by porn star? That's correct. Q. And did you run an article with that headline in the National Enquirer? Yes, Q. Is there any story behind that one? I would like to clarify, just so it's clear, that when we were preparing an article, let's say for Ted Cruz, we communicated what we were doing in the direction of the article with Michael Cohen. We would also send him the PDFs of the stories before it was published so he could see what direction they were going, that we were moving to, and he would comment on them. So we would add content based on the information that Michael Cohen had. Did he ever tell you whether he had shared these headlines with the boss prior to their publication? I don't recollect that, no. Q. Now, did any withdrawn? Did there come a time when candidate Trump introduced you to Stephen Bannon? Yes, I am getting ahead of myself a little bit. I want to show you one or more of these headlines. MRVSTEINGLASS. Can we show them to the jury and the witness? Thank you. Q. Scroll down to page 3. First headline, do you remember anything about the history of this article in particular, this headline that states Ted Cruz sex scandal, 5 secret mistresses? I don't remember the details of it, but I remember the article. Q. Do you remember discussing it with Michael Cohen prior to its publication? We would have discussed it, yes. Q. I am going to show you one more from this exhibit, which is 153B, page 5, top headline, Donald Trump blasts Ted Cruz's dad for photo with JFK assassin. Do you remember anything about the history behind this article? Yes. Dylan Howard had the research department take a look at Ted Cruz's father's photos, and we matched the photos in every different picture with that of Lee Harvey Oswald, and we matched the two together. That's how that story was prepared and created, I should say. Q. And these articles that pertain to Ted Cruz, are they mostly around the spring of 2016? May I see that? Q. Yes, if you queued, I am talking about the whole bunch of them. Want we can flip through them just to make sure you are comfortable answering that. Yes, Q. So the question is, are these articles mostly around the spring? Mostly around the spring. Q. Of 2016? Yes, Q. Had Ted Cruz been gaining popularity as a candidate at that time? I believe so. Q. Finally, I am going to show you 153C and ask you, whom do these headlines pertain? Marco Rubio. Q. And were these articles published toward the end of 2015, beginning of 2016? Yes, they were. Q. And had Marco Rubio been gaining popularity at that time? I believe he was. Q. Do you remember when he dropped out of the race? No, I don't. Q. Why were you running these stories about Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and Ben Carson? After the Republican debates, and based on the success of some of the other candidates, I would receive a call from Michael Cohen and he would direct me and direct Dylan Howard on which candidate and which direction we should go. That's how the process happened. Q. Now, I started to ask you before, did there come a time when then candidate Trump introduced you to Stephen Bannon? Yes, he did. Q. Do you remember around when that was? It was October of 2016. Who was Stephen Bannon at the time? Q. Stephen Bannon was a political consultant for Donald Trump. And was he working on Donald Trump's campaign? Q. It was my understanding he was working on the Yes campaign. Q. What, if anything, did Mr. Trump tell you about Stephen Bannon? He said to me that I believe that you and Stephen would get along really well. And Bannon, when I spoke to him, he said that he went through some of these articles that you just displayed now, liked them very much. He had some other ideas, and would I be able to get him some other issues of the National Enquirer he could take a look at? So in that meeting, I boxed up a bunch of issues of the National Enquirer that had Hillary and stories along those lines, and I remember sending it to his apartment, was someplace on the Upper West Side. Q. His apartment being? Stephen Bannon's apartment. Q. Did Donald Trump tell you specifically what or even generally what he wanted you to do vis Stephen Bannon? He said that he thought that both of us could work very well together. And then after Bannon reviewed the articles, he called me and he said that Mr. above objection. The court sustained. Q. When you were starting to answer, don't say what he or she was going to say. Who is the he that you were referring to in the answer that you were just about to give? Is the he Stephen Bannon or was the he Donald Trump? The he was Stephen Bannon. Q. What did you do after withdrawn? Did Mr. Bannon ever pitch any articles to the National Enquirer? Mr. Bove objection. The court overruled. You can answer. What he suggested was that, based on some of the Hillary articles that we had, that we should take a National Enquirer reporter and have them go on the Hannity show and discuss the articles with Hannity. Articles that you had written? Q. Mr. Bove objection. Move to strike. The court sustained. That answer is stricken. Q. So, I am not asking you about articles that you did run or you had already run. Did Stephen Bannon ever ask you to run objection? May I be heard at sidebar? The court, sure. Mr. Bove, thank you for hearing me, Judge. This is entirely hearsay. I understand that the witness at times is going beyond what Mr. Steinglass is any particular articles. Mr. Bove, matter asserted. Asking, I respect that. In terms of whatever the jury is hearing regarding admissible testimony, I don't think there is much of any with respect to this topic on Mr. Bannon. The court, Mr. Steinglass. Mr. Steinglass, first of all, none of the statements that were elicited are hearsay at all. They're not statements that are being offered for the truth of these are people who are at the defendant's behest, who are working with the witness to either pump up the positive stories about Mr. Trump or pump negative stories about the opponents. That is part of the whole scheme here. These are almost like verbal acts. It's not for the truth of the matter being asserted if the witness is asked if Stephen Bannon asked witness to run a particular story. The court, so you are not offering the statement for its truth? I need to give the jury an instruction. Ms. Nicholies, these stories, he is not offering these stories, but the fact that Stephen Bannon asked this of the witness for the truth. He wants to put in evidence that Stephen Bannon asked this to show that Stephen Bannon did, in fact, ask it. That's the definition of for the truth. That is pure hearsay. The stories, he is not putting the stories in, he is putting testimony about what Stephen Bannon did. I think there are several answers. And Marcia Steinglass, to that, but at least one of them is, if there are multiple co-conspirators, this is going to come up soon, if there are multiple co-conspirators who are anyway conspiring to influence the election under the election law, that is part of the secondary crime, which we have to